Sure. So my name is Saleemul Huq. I am the director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development, which is based at the Independent University in Dhaka, Bangladesh. And most of my work is on adaptation to climate change, and more recently also looking at loss and damage from climate change. And that links very closely to disaster risk reduction and the aftermath of climate-related disasters. So I do a lot of work both in Bangladesh as well as in other least developed countries in Asia and Africa. I'm an advisor to the group of least developed countries, currently led by Bhutan. It's a group of 47 poor countries that are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And I advise them in the international negotiations under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, particularly on adaptation and loss and damage issues. And also in my university, we we run a course on climate change and development, a master's course, and we get students from different countries to come and participate in that course as well. So Bangladesh is well known as one of the most vulnerable countries to the impacts of climate change. It's a small country of only 144,000 square kilometers with a population of well over 160 million people. So that's more than 1,000 people per square kilometer, very, very dense country. Also a relatively poor country, one of the least developed countries, and located on the delta of three of the world's biggest rivers, the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, and the Meghna, which makes it a very, very vulnerable country. We've known this for a long time now, well over 10 years. And so we have not been sitting idle. The country has been developing national climate change action plans, implementing them within government and outside government. I organize a platform of universities and research institutes, currently numbering about 60 institutions, called Gobeshona, which is a Bangla word for research. This platform regularly meets. We share current research, and we do a big conference every January to share that and disseminate the results of the research that we do. So the country of Bangladesh is taking the climate change issue very, very seriously. The government of Bangladesh has invested considerable amount of money, set up a climate change trust fund, in which the finance minister allocates at least $100 million each year in the national budget to carry out activities and projects so that we learn what to do. So I would say Bangladesh is going up the learning curve in terms of how to deal with the problem of climate change, and particularly in the short term, in terms of the increased frequency and intensity of cyclones and floods. In fact, right now, Bangladesh is undergoing a flood, and we expect even more waters to come from Nepal, which is currently flooded, as the waters come down the Ganges to Bangladesh in the next few days. So so what we did first, was the government of Bangladesh commissioned experts, Bangladeshi experts, to carry out a study and come out with a plan. It's called the Bangladesh Climate Change Strategy and Action Plan. And it has 6 pillars, including health, livelihoods, and various others, under which it identified around 40 plus actions that needed to be taken. Now, in response to that report and the recommendations, the government then set up a climate change trust fund, which, as I said, the finance minister put in roughly $100 million each year in Bangladesh taka equivalent into the trust fund. And that trust fund would then support and fund many, many different activities which were submitted through both government and non-governmental channels. So there was a window for NGOs to apply for the money, and the larger amount, 90% went to government, 10% went to NGOs. And each year, about 100 million or so was allocated to hundreds of projects within government and outside government. And as a result, over the last 10 years, nearly $1 billion has been allocated or spent on hundreds of projects in Bangladesh, which has enabled different ministries, different agencies to understand what it means for them and to figure out what they need to do. And in fact, what has happened now is that in the current budget, this year's national budget, instead of allocating a separate fund, it is now incorporated into the national budget itself. So about 8%, 8.5% of the national budget is now allocated, the current year's budget, for climate change activities in about 20 different ministries. And that is now becoming part of their mainstream activities. It's mainstreaming climate change adaptation into national development rather than having separate parallel funds and projects, which we did for about 10 years. Well, yes and no. The nationally determined contributions that are required by the Paris Agreement of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change make it mandatory for countries to provide information on how they will reduce their emissions of greenhouse gases. What they will do on adaptation is left as an option. They can put that in or they cannot put that in if they don't want to. So that's an optional category. And that's what I work on, mostly adaptation. In Bangladesh's case, we have included adaptation in our nationally determined contribution. But the nationally determined contributions are required to include mitigation activities, greenhouse gas reductions. And that's what government of Bangladesh has done. So on the mitigation side, Bangladesh has offered to reduce our emissions by 5% by 2030 by ourselves without any additional assistance. However, we have also offered to do more. We can do 15% reduction of our greenhouse gases compared to the baseline projections if we get technology and funding to do that. So, and this is across 4 sectors. These are industry, energy, transport, and forestry.
Does the NDC have loss and damage as well? Because I know Bangladesh is like very keen on issues related to loss and damage. So do the NDC cover loss and damage?
The NDC, as far as I know, does not include loss and damage. It does include something on adaptation, but it has not included anything on loss and damage. I would say primarily because the guidance for the NDC does not require it. And these NDCs are very much documents prepared by countries in response to their obligations under the Paris Agreement. And the Paris Agreement mandates, as I said, they have to give us a mitigation plan. So that's the #1 priority. They can include adaptation if they want to include adaptation. That's extra work that they have to do voluntarily. Many countries, by the way, have done that. More than half the countries have included adaptation. So that's a good thing. And they don't tell them anything about loss and damage. So most of them don't do anything on loss and damage. So what Bangladesh has done is blend the requirements from the global level into the national planning process. And there are 2 global processes that we, or 3 global processes that we are trying to incorporate into the national process. The first one is the Sendai framework on disaster risk reduction, which is something that all countries are supposed to do in terms of national interest and national capacity building on disaster risk reduction. And Bangladesh is quite good at that. Bangladesh has been very, very proactive on that. It has been a whole of society approach, government and non-government agencies collaborating together. The second one is the Paris Agreement, also a 2030 timeline for both mitigation and adaptation. We now have an adaptation goal in the Paris Agreement, even though, as I said, it's not a mandatory requirement in the NDC. It is still a global goal, and Bangladesh is taking that very seriously, both mitigation and adaptation into its national development. And the third, even bigger framework are the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, of which SDG 13 is on climate and is effectively the Paris Agreement on climate. And the government of Bangladesh and civil society in Bangladesh have set up a very elaborate institutional structure to fulfill the requirements of each and every one of the 17 SDGs. Within government, there is a lead ministry with the several supporting ministries who have responsibility for implementing each of the SDGs. On SDG 13, climate change, it's the Ministry of Environment and Forests and Climate Change. And then in parallel to the government effort, there is a civil society-led effort managed by one of our leading think tanks. It's called the Center for Policy Dialogue, where they have brought together civil society actors who work in different sectors around each of the SDGs. And on SDG 13, for example, ActionAid Bangladesh is taking the lead together with my center, the International Center for Climate Change and Development, bringing together civil society actors who are working on climate change so that we coordinate and share our information with each other and collectively can make an effort to fulfill the goals of the Sustainable Development Goals, again, by 2030. So 2030 timeline, another 11 years or so to go. Bangladesh is gearing itself up to try and achieve all 17 SDGs, both the Paris Agreement goals on mitigation and adaptation and the DRR goals under the Sendai framework, and put them into the national context. So these are not isolated things happening by themselves, but these are embedded and mainstreamed into national development. National mechanism is linked to the SDGs, and SDG 13 is linked to climate change. And so and in my view, that is a much better mechanism because it is an all of government. In fact, it's an all of society mechanism that takes along everybody. Whereas previously the climate change activities were confined to the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change, which in Bangladesh, as in every other country, is really a very weak ministry. It does not have much ability to change what happens in the government. It's usually a regulatory ministry on pollution and so on. And so if climate change is to be taken seriously, it needs to be taken seriously as a national development effort. And all parts of development activities and investments need to be climate sensitive and climate informed in order for us to tackle climate change. It's not something you can compartmentalize and give to one ministry and say, you do it and solve the problem. They can't do it that way. Sure. So I mentioned that Bangladesh had done what we call the Bangladesh Climate Change Strategy and Action Plan in 2009, now 10 years ago. It's now being updated. The experts who were involved in the original plan, including myself, we were asked to update it. We've done our inputs now, and that will be released soon to 2030. Not a huge change, but what will be the biggest change will be, as I mentioned now, we will be mainstreaming climate change into national development and not just having parallel activities as we had for the last 10 years. And what we are doing in effect is a NAP, a National Adaptation Plan, before the UNFCCC invented the word NAP. So Bangladesh has done a NAP before the UNFCCC. It's a long-term climate change strategy. And interestingly, the 6 pillars that I mentioned of the Bangladesh Climate Change Strategy and Action Plan includes a mitigation pillar. Even though Bangladesh is a very vulnerable country, emits very little greenhouse gases, need not have included mitigation, but we felt we ought to, and we did. So one of the pillars is what we can do to reduce our emissions, and we have promised to do what we can. As I mentioned, we are promising to reduce emissions by 5% by 2030 entirely on our own. We have a very vigorous solar home system program in Bangladesh. 5 million households have solar lighting right now. It's the biggest in the world. So Bangladesh is doing its bit, even if it's a small emitter of greenhouse gases and a very, very vulnerable country for whom adaptation is by far the most important part of dealing with the climate change problem. But nevertheless, we are also doing mitigation. Now, in terms of the official UNFCCC-driven NAP process, National Adaptation Plans process that different countries are now doing, Bangladesh is actually quite behind on that schedule, the UNFCCC-driven schedule, because of various reasons about who would be in charge and how to manage it. I believe those problems have now been sorted out, and we should be developing our NAP, as I said, which is a UNFCCC-driven exercise. But as I said, Bangladesh is way, way ahead of the UNFCCC here. We have a National Climate Change Strategy and Action Plan in place for the last 10 years, in which we have invested nearly $1 billion of our own money in going up a learning curve on how to deal with the impacts of climate change. So we are orders of magnitude ahead of other countries that are now starting to do their NAPs. But we haven't done our official NAP yet. Well, there's always major gaps in knowledge. First of all, the different sectors that I mentioned, energy, industry, transport, they're not familiar with the climate change problem. So they had to be made familiar, they had to understand, they had to see what it is that they're doing now that causes emissions, what it is that they could do to reduce emissions and to do it in a way that actually helps development and doesn't hinder development. So that has been a learning curve, and everything is a learning curve. And we have gone up that learning curve, and the country as a whole has made its own decisions as to what it thinks it can do, what it promises to do, and what it hopes it can do with additional support. And the additional support is mainly in terms of money and also in terms of technology and knowledge on how to do things. But at the same time, particularly when it comes to adaptation, as I mentioned earlier, Bangladesh is already way ahead of many other countries and has already learned many things itself, which it can also share with other countries. So the knowledge sphere is not a one-way traffic of people with knowledge, say in the north or the rich countries, giving it to the south and the poor countries. The poor countries have much to teach the north and the rich countries as well, particularly when it comes to surviving the impacts of climate change, which we have learned how to do and they don't know. Policies are not the gap in Bangladesh. I would say we are very good at adopting good policies. Where we are very bad is implementing them. And so we have them on paper, but we don't have them on practice. And that really is a very big gap. In fact, the Prime Minister recently made a big speech about this issue, saying that, we write these policies, we have the regulations, we have laws, but we don't implement them well. And so now the emphasis is on better governance, less corruption, more implementation of the good things that we promise to do for the people, for the country, for the environment, and don't allow those who are destroying it, those who are doing adverse activities, to get away with that. Unfortunately, they have been getting away with plundering the environment, destroying the environment, causing more destruction, and that cannot be allowed to happen anymore. And that's not lack of policy. We have the policy, we have the regulations. That's lack of implementing those policies and regulations, and that's what we need to do now.
Yeah. Thank you, Saleem. Would you like to add anything in closing? I think we got a lot of information from you. Anything else you would like
so
to?
let me just share with you an opportunity that I'd like to invite all your viewers to take advantage of if they want. We do a big annual event every January. The next one will be from the 20th to the 24th of January in Dhaka, Bangladesh. It's called the annual Gobeshona Conference. As I mentioned, Gobeshona is a Bangla word for research, and it is a platform currently of 60 institutions, mostly universities, but also research institutes in Bangladesh and outside, who work on climate change in Bangladesh. It's a 4-day conference. The theme of the conference is on research into action, not just pure research. It's to enable people to take actions at the national and local level in the country to tackle climate change. It's a 3-day science conference with many different themes and scientists, several hundred scientists presenting their research. And the 4th day is a science policy dialogue day where we invite policymakers and we share from the research community key findings from our research, which we hope policymakers can take into account in their policymaking, decision-making. And also, very importantly, we get from them instructions or questions on what kind of research would be useful for them to make the correct decisions going forward. So it's a feedback loop. Each year we review where we are in terms of our knowledge on climate change, tackling climate change, and then we identify what more do we need to be doing in terms of carrying out research. And we've been doing this for 5 years now. Next year's conference will be the 6th conference in the series, and we are going to make this into a global event next year. So I invite all your viewers, if they can come to Bangladesh, they're most welcome to do so. If not, they can at least watch it live or even recordings of it in January, and I'd be very happy to provide more information on that.